So much of what we infer about a place comes from observing the people who occupy it. But how much of what we observe is essential? How much information do we really need to create a sense of place? Lanny is a book that examines life by stripping it back to something simple and accessible. The things we say behind closed doors, amongst friends, in everyday conversation. This polyphony of voices meanders and overlaps, leaving space for us as readers to fill. Whether it's a result of his time as an editor or his own education as an artist, it's clear that Porter values white space, because it gives readers something to do. It invites us to embed pieces of ourselves within his storytelling. The majority of these conversations are filtered through a fantastical figure, dead Papa Toothwort. He's modelled on the Green Man from English folklore and is described by Porter as a mythic voyeur. This is a being who savours and revels in the textures and rhythms of language, and he weaves stories from the distant past in with stories from our current moment. With us in tow, he inhales the language and dialect of the village. Everyday conversation, grudges, grumbles, delights, he consumes them all. And with each sampled phrase, we get a clearer insight into the village. He is the eyes and ears through which we learn the language of the book, and it's no mistake that the first word he uncovers when he wakes from his slumber and hauls himself towards the village is seedling. Porter talks about how more abstract language forces the reader to undergo a change, shedding our laziness about language and leaving representative thinking at the door. Through the fragments of village life we get from Papa Toothwort, Porter is encouraging us to participate in the imagining of the village. He includes us in it, connects us to it so that later on in the book, we feel the changes that happen there more deeply. Lanny is divided into 3 acts. In the first, each segment is labelled with the speaker's name. Dead Papa Toothwort, Lanny's dad, Lanny's mum, and Pete. They all get headers. In the second act, these headers are taken away as structure collapses and the cacophony of the village in crisis takes over. Despite the lack of labelling, we still recognise the voices as they come because we've observed them through Dead Papa Toothwort. We can identify them from their own rhythms and idiosyncrasies. But then, in the third act, there's a blending of what's come before. The unattached voices merge and form a more traditional narrative, only now we're so saturated with the community's secrets that we can bring a more cultured understanding of what's happening, one that might otherwise have been absent. Porter talks about how preoccupied he is with the ways readers can build characters beyond the writer's determination of them. He gives the example of Alice Oswald's The River Dart in one interview to illustrate his intention. He talks about how she creates the river by telling us how it is considered by the natural world around it and the people who use it, so that it becomes a mirror on human activity. Much like the River Dart, as time goes on, Lanny becomes that mirror on human activity. We're never allowed into the boy's head, nor are we granted his point of view. Instead, we learn about him through the eyes and impressions of those around him. All of them watch Lanny, giving us snippets of his life. He hangs upside down, invents beasts, speaks to 100-year-old girls under trees, and watching him do this, we feel the lightness of his presence. And tied in with these observations of Lanny are details about the village. All these little moments continue to develop that wider community, setting little hooks that snag at our memories and settle them into place to build a whole. Beyond the fact that the book is named after him, there are other clues to Lanny's importance early in the book. He is the one who Dead Papa Toothwort seeks out, and in doing so paints a picture of rusted jeep bonnets, nettles, and kissing gates. Through his hunt for Lanny, we build the first few lanes and streets of the village, and when he finds him, that too is notable. Where other inhabitants of the village get 3, maybe 5 words, Lanny gets a sentence, a complete thought. Then, as the book goes on, Lanny begins to take on a similar role to dead Papa Toothwort. His disappearance in the second half of the book reveals sides of the community that were previously only visible to that snooping gaze. Nowhere is his link to dead Papa Toothwort clearer for me than when he chants his own collected snippets of the village under his breath. But for Lanny, it's less about comprehension, it's more an echoing of sounds he's heard. It's a link to dead Papa Toothwort's own tapestry of words. In weaving his own creation from the words of the village, Lanny demonstrates how he stood astride these two worlds of the modern and deep time. Porter has talked about how Lanny intuits the Anthropocene and is at that point of childhood where you understand the world but haven't been caught up in the guzzling, frantic, complicit poisoning of adult life that the rest of the village is suffering from. Porter's talked about how this book is for him about how a community draws on its superstitious underbelly, or how a tiny flicker of something like xenophobia, hostility, or even casual racism becomes a flame in times of crisis. But he's also talked about the relief that a perspective like dead Papa Toothwort's gave him. He talks about the catharsis of viewing a moment in time through a mind that's been watching for thousands of years. Dead Papa Toothwort is an escape from the very aggressive specificity of this moment of populism, and it's interesting to me that Lanny seems to act as a conduit to that sensation to those around him. He acts as an oasis, a calming influence, and when he's no longer there, all of the village's inhabitants begin to collapse back into their more base behaviours. The pace of the novel changes after Lanny's disappearance. I've mentioned already how in the second act of the book the headings fall away and we no longer get an indication of who's speaking. This has the twin effect of speeding up the book as people's thoughts and conversations string into one another, and also illustrating the way the entire community has become bound up with this one drama of Lanny's disappearance. Old Papa Toothwort disappears for much of this segment, and what we get is an almost constant stream of the community under pressure. Porter's minimal approach has us follow the ripples of conversation Jolie leaves in her frantic wake. The community starts to hum with her plight, with Lanny's name, and then everything starts to blend together. Where previously individual thoughts and speakers were clearly segregated, now they overlap with one another, occupying the same space, creating small micro-scenes between two or more characters. It's a cacophony, but we can decode it because we've been primed to by Porter. So we can stand in the middle of the whole thing, having become in many ways like dead Papa Toothwort ourselves, letting the community wash over us, feeding on their language. Except it's no longer just this community, it's the outside world flooding into that community, feeding on the tragedy of Lanny's disappearance, and those outside influences are discordant. They're notable amongst the voices we've grown familiar with now, and that discord starts to eke into those familiar voices, bringing out the worst in them. It's a delicate critique of the ways national politics and malices can filter down from the very top into the local and bring their poison with them. It's easy to think of Lanny as a very English novel. It's been called a novel about Brexit, about the growing problems of xenophobia in our current political moment, but to call it that somewhat hides the brilliant potential of this novel. After all, the word Brexit never appears in the book, and the climate crisis, while present, lurks in illusion and things half said. For me, one of the great successes of this novel is the fact that it can be transplanted across time and space onto many different small towns with their own politicking and gossip. The characters inferred throughout the book are recesses familiar enough that we can pool our experience into them and create familiar faces, familiar characters. the local bigot, the busybody neighbour, the obsessive gardener. Their outlines are all there in the book, but they come to life when we encounter them. Their substance flows from us. That's the impact of Porter's white space, of his trust in the reader's capacity, and that's why the snippets and whispers he scatters throughout Lanny make such a cultured and layered sound.